Today's video is about what rights permanent residents of the US do not have. Yesterday, I posted a video about what rights permanent residents have under the US Constitution. So if you're interested in that video, check it out. Spoiler alert, it's most of the same rights that US citizens have. So today we're gonna be talking about some specific things that permanent residents cannot do. All right, the first one is actually a big one. Voting in federal elections. That is a huge problem if any permanent resident votes in a US election. First of all, it can be construed as a false claim to US citizenship, especially since most voter registration has you sign something or check off a box or at least state that you are a US citizen. Any false claim to US citizen that is not timely retracted, basically if you don't fix the error like immediately, there's no way to fix that in the future. You're deportable, inadmissible, the whole 9 yards. There's no way to fix that. No amount of money that you pay to a lawyer can ever fix that. So if you're not a US citizen, you can never vote in a federal election. Practically speaking, I think in most states, it's not that easy to do that anyway, but every state has their own voter registration rules, so it's a state-by-state determination. The next right that permanent residents don't have is running for elected office in Congress or US presidency. In fact, even if you're a US citizen, you can't run for president of the US unless you were born in the US. Naturalized citizens cannot run for presidency in the US, so that's another thing. Permanent residents also don't have access to all federal jobs. Some federal jobs are restricted to US citizens. I mentioned this in my video that I posted yesterday, but I'm just repeating it here because you might find that you don't have all the same protections to employment that US citizens have if you're a permanent resident. Permanent residents don't have the same flexibility in traveling internationally as US citizens. In fact, if you've been out of the US for too long, you can be denied re-entry and placed into removal proceedings or forced to sign a Form I-407 in the airport to voluntarily abandon your permanent residency. I've done a couple videos on this. Here's a summary. You don't actually have to sign the Form I-407, but if you don't, you'll likely be placed into removal proceedings, allowed into the US, and then a judge has to determine whether you actually intended to abandon your permanent residency. If you're interested in that topic, I've done several videos on it, or you could schedule a consultation with me to discuss your particular situation. This is also another reason why I tell people they should apply for US citizenship as soon as possible, especially permanent residents who are getting older. I frequently see a situation where permanent residents want to retire abroad or go back to their home country. They want to continue to collect Social Security. They've been paying into it for 30 years. And the answer is become a US citizen, because if you're a permanent resident and you leave the US for more than 1 year continuously, you are presumed to have abandoned your residency. And if you lose your residency, you're no longer entitled to receive your Social Security benefits. In reality, you shouldn't really be leaving the US for more than 6 months continuously. And in some situations, even if you come back every 5 months, if there's a pattern, a consistent pattern showing you're spending the vast majority of your time outside of the US, you can still be pressured by customs officers in the airport to voluntarily abandon your residency or be placed into removal proceedings. For example, I see it all the time where people come to the US for like 2 to 4 weeks and then they leave for 5 months, come back for 2 to 4 weeks, leave for 5 months. And they do this many times in a row, sometimes for years on end. Eventually, you run the risk of a customs officer pulling you to a back room, it's called secondary inspection, and asking you all sorts of questions to determine what your intent actually is. Do you intend to permanently live in the US, which is a requirement for your permanent resident status? Or are you actually living abroad and using your green card as like a glorified tourist visa? They can ask you questions such as, where are you working? Where are you living? Where are you receiving mail? Do you have a permanent address in the US? Do you have a lease agreement, a mortgage? Do you have utility statements to show us that you're actively paying for this place in the United States? Are you filing tax returns? If so, what is the address listed on your tax return? These are just some preliminary questions. The interview can get much deeper than that. And at the end of the interview, they'll determine whether you intended to reside abroad or in the US. If they determine that you haven't been intending to live in the US during this time, they can place you into removal proceedings or try to get you to voluntarily abandon your residency by signing Form I-407. And on the note of trying to re-enter the US, not all permanent residents have the right to re-enter the US. The most notable example of permanent residents who are not allowed to come back is permanent residents who have committed certain crimes that render them inadmissible. For example, let's say you have a green card, you're a permanent resident, and you commit a crime that makes you inadmissible but not deportable. This is a complicated distinction. You can do a deep dive into this topic. It's for a whole nother video. I've done videos on this in the past. But to make a long story short, if you commit like a somewhat serious crime or even a not so serious crime in some situations, you might not be deportable. But if you ever leave the US, you're inadmissible and can't come back without being placed into removal proceedings or detained sometimes in some situations in the airport. Sometimes the remedy to this is to just not travel internationally, wait more than 5 years since the commission of the crime to show that you've had good character for at least the 5 years, and then apply for naturalization. So it's kind of interesting. You're eligible for naturalization, but you're not eligible to leave the US and re-enter as a permanent resident. Doesn't always make sense, but that's immigration law for you. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of today's video. If you have any specific immigration related questions, you could always schedule a consultation directly with me. I focus on family-based immigration and naturalization, and you can find my information in the video description below. If you're new to my channel and you're interested in learning more about immigration related topics or changes to immigration under the Trump administration, be sure to subscribe. I put out several videos each week, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for another video.